everybody, let's talk Portuguese. Today's video is going to be all about the special relationship between Galician and Portuguese throughout history up to the modern day. But before we get into today's video, if you're enjoying my channel and the videos that I make and you'd like to support me, you can do so on Patreon. Patreon is basically a place where you can buy me a coffee and in return you get little exclusive extras. Those extras include things like knowing what I'm working on next first, extra resources that I find as I'm doing my research into Portuguese linguistics, as well as extras specifically from each video that I make. I'm also offering fun things like postcards sent directly from me to you. So if that sounds interesting to you, head on over to patreon.com/Sashinka where you can find out all of the details. Now, on with the video. Today's video is going to be all about the special relationship between Galician and Portuguese throughout history up through the modern day, as I mentioned previously. Now, if you don't speak Portuguese already, you may be asking yourself what exactly Galician is and how and why it is relevant to Portuguese in the first place. But if you speak Portuguese already, then you are almost guaranteed to know that Portuguese and Galician share the exact same linguistic roots. What that means is that Galician and Portuguese formed identically. Indeed, if you go back into history from the time that Vulgar Latin was forming into the Romance languages, all the way through the medieval period, the language was referred to as Galician Portuguese or Galaico Portuguese. This brings into question whether or not we should consider Galician its own language or within the dialectal sphere of Portuguese. This is in fact a hotly contested question that there is no definitive linguistic answer for. There are quite a lot of people who defend the idea that Galician is its own separate language. The argument behind that is that there have been several hundreds of years of linguistic and political developments that have separated it into its own distinct linguistic sphere. On the other hand, there are those who vociferously defend the idea that Galician belongs within the realm of Portuguese linguistics. This perspective argues that with their shared origin and continued extreme similarities linguistically, that they should be considered one and the same language, and that they would, as a result, simply be dialectal variants of one mother language. Now, I am not here in this video to take a side one way or another on that question. Whether a language is its own language or simply a dialect of another one is primarily a political question. There is no strict, clean-cut definition of what a language or a dialect is in linguistics. What this means is that when we're talking about Galician and Portuguese, it's not especially relevant or useful to distinguish one as being a separate language or dialect of the other. But as we're talking about politics and language, the birth of Portuguese as a language in its own right was in fact a chiefly political event. As you may well know, the Romance languages formed from Vulgar Latin, or the Latin that people actually spoke, as opposed to the normative standard of Latin that we know as Classical Latin. All of the Romance languages therefore existed on something of a dialectal spectrum. If you look beyond the major Romance languages into the regional languages that exist in countries like Italy, France, and Spain, you will see that many of these smaller regional languages have features that are similar to one or another of their neighboring major Romance language. For political reasons, in many countries, these languages are called dialects. They are treated as substandard versions of the national language. But the linguistic reality is that the Romance languages formed out of dialect continuums. What this means for Portuguese and Galician is that the form of Vulgar Latin spoken in the northwestern corner of the Iberian Peninsula is the Vulgar Latin that would go on to give birth to Galician Portuguese. It, naturally speaking, was very similar to dialects spoken in what is now Asturias and even what would go on to become Castilian Spanish itself. But initially, this was restricted to the northeastern corner of the Iberian Peninsula. That corresponds to Galicia and what is now the north of Portugal. And the birth of Portuguese as a separate entity is intimately tied to Portugal's history as an independent nation. With the formation of Portugal, Portugal separate from Galicia as a political entity, Portuguese quickly became its own language with its own set of rules and regulations and use in the Portuguese court. This, of course, was in the 12th century, so it all started about 800 to 900 years ago. In the meantime, Portugal remained an independent country with its own subsequent linguistic politics, and Galicia fell under the influence of Castile. And in order to understand Galician and its role in Spanish culture, we have to understand what Spain really is as a historical political project. Contrary to popular belief, Spanish culture and history is not one singular entity. There are and have always been many regions of Spain with their own cultural and linguistic identities, and that is because the Iberian Peninsula was always home to different cultural and linguistic populations, however closely related they may be. Spanish history is of course marked by the reconquest of the Iberian Peninsula, and then later on by the consolidation of all of the monarchical territories within its bounds. What this means is that by conquest and through political marriages, Spain became Spain by virtue of the amalgamation of a bunch of different populations. The central force in this, of course, is Castile and its language, which we now know as Spanish, but is also known as Castilian Spanish. But it's important to take into consideration that it wasn't until recent centuries that many regions of what is now Spain did not speak Castilian Spanish natively. These regions, like Galicia, had their own languages with their own linguistic histories and their own unique linguistic situations. However, with the dominance of the Castilians and their influence politically, it is only natural that Castilian Spanish would come to heavily influence these regional languages. This is especially true of Galician itself, and many of the differences between Portuguese and Galician nowadays are the result of hundreds of years of Spanish influence on Galician. So fundamentally, the reason that Portuguese and Galician are considered separately is for political reasons. As Portugal was consolidating itself as a nation-state, the Kingdom of Galicia was incorporated into the overarching Crown of Castile. With all of that being said, up until recent generations, the Galician spoken near the border with Portugal was practically indistinguishable from the Portuguese dialects that were spoken along the border itself. The extremely high level of mutual intelligibility in these regions would lend itself to the idea that Galician and Portuguese belong on a dialectal spectrum. However, there have been some things that have distanced Galician and Portuguese even further in modern history. One of these main developments is in fact the changes that Portuguese was undergoing starting from the 1800s that would go on to radically affect the phonetic nature of Portuguese itself. Galician itself did not take on most of these phonetic changes, and many of these changes would not go on to consolidate themselves across Portugal until the mid to latter part of the 20th century. It is of course also true that in Spain there existed a repressive dictatorship in the 20th century. This political regime sought to stamp out the regional dialects and identities in Spain in order to form a more cohesive nation-state along the lines of what happened in France. Although that project was not entirely successful, it did change the fundamental nature of linguistic usage in Spain. One of the biggest effects that had on regional languages in Spain, including in Galicia, was the shift from the use of the general public of these regions to using Spanish. Slowly but surely, starting in the cities and nowadays extending to much of the countryside itself, Spanish began to supplant Galician in everyday use. This has of course resulted in quite a lot of Castilian influence in Galician nowadays that maybe didn't exist to the same extent at the start of the 20th century. Since the restoration of democracy in Spain, regions that have their own linguistic and cultural identities have been free to assert those and promote them, and that continues to be a political project in Galicia nowadays. But the simple fact remains that Spanish is gaining ground quite quickly in Galicia as the native language of young people, and all of the linguistic implications for Galician that has. But if we shift back to Portuguese and Galician themselves, let's take a look at some of the things that are different. One of the most immediate differences that you'll notice between Portuguese and Galician is of course the writing system. The official orthography of Galician as used by the public administration in Galicia and taught in Galician schools is one that is based on Castilian orthography. This means it uses a double L where we have LH in Portuguese and an N with a tilde on it where we have an NH in Portuguese. This of course has its own political background, but it is in detriment to a more Portuguese style orthography. That being said, there are groups in Galicia who use a more Portuguese style orthography using NH and LH, as well as the C with the cedille on it instead of Z. So therefore we have basically two different competing standards in Galicia Galicia. However, the more Spanish-influenced one is the one that is taught in public schools. However, there are also many fundamental differences between Galician and Portuguese. Galician did not undergo quite a lot of the dramatic sound shifts that Portuguese itself did. Over the course of the last 500 years, Portuguese has undergone quite a lot of sound shifts, and if you'd like to learn more about that, you can check out my videos about the evolution of Portuguese as a language. But that being said, quite a lot of those sound shifts did not occur in Galician, and many of them might have occurred in Galician, but only in certain regions. Galicia itself is of course not dialectically homogeneous. There are different accents or dialects throughout the Galician-speaking territory. Some of these sound differences include things like Galician lacking voiced fricative consonants. So wherever we have a j sound in Portuguese, Galician uses a sh. If we were to say já in Portuguese, in Galician they say chá. If we say gente in Portuguese, in Galician that is gente. Galician also does not reduce its vowels to the same extent as Portuguese, although in some regions you may hear the reduction of certain word final vowels like o to u as we do in Portuguese. However, by and large, word final vowels in Galician are not reduced, and they retain their ordinary vowel quality. Galician pronunciation also adopted a Castilian-sounding th pronunciation with the letter C and Z. So throughout much of the Galician-speaking territories, you have thion instead of são in Portuguese. Galician also retained the ch sound, which became sh in Portuguese. A feature of the Portuguese in the north of Portugal is, of course, the lenition of B and V into the same sound. This transformation of the B and V sounds into something between both of them is absolutely characteristic of Galician itself. This lenition in Portugal is speculated by some to be in fact a Galician influence on those dialects close to the Galician border in Portugal. Regardless, as in Spanish, in Galician B and V have the same sound. There are a whole host of other phonetic differences between Galician and Portuguese. Galician has a different system of nasalizing vowels that doesn't go nearly as far as Portuguese itself does, and Galician also didn't undergo the modern transformation of some of its diphthongs. So modern Galician has o instead of oi. They say cousa instead of coisa like we do in Portuguese. But there are some grammatical differences between Galician and Portuguese as well. Galician retained a lot of grammatical features that would be considered archaic in Portuguese, including certain pronoun particles and the use of voz. You can see the older forms of certain contractions and linguistic patterns in modern Galician. In Galician, the contraction of pur and ua is polu and pola instead of pelu and pela, just to name a few among many little distinctions. But one of the biggest differences, grammatically speaking, between Galician and Portuguese is in the use of verbal tenses. Galician, in everyday spontaneous use, by and large does not have what are known as the tempos compostos in Portuguese. The compound tenses of Portuguese are an integral part of the Portuguese language, and they are widely used with all verbal categories. In Galician, however, it is often claimed that tempos compostos don't even exist. It is not entirely true to say that compound tenses don't exist in Galician. However, they are a relatively unnatural or artificial form of speaking in Galician, and they are relegated mostly to formal uses. They are especially encouraged in administrative or legal and formal documents, and they are not widely used by the Galician public. This is in fact true of Galician Spanish. Galician speakers of Spanish are also well known for not using the compound tenses that are common throughout the rest of Spain. Galician substitutes some of the compound tenses with the pluperfect singular tense that is basically relegated to literary uses in Portugal. In Galician, its use is very normal and widespread. There are also, of course, quite a lot of lexical differences between Galician and Portuguese, words that look the same but have slightly different meanings between both Galician and Portuguese, but those would be too many to list in this video alone, so if you're interested in that, you might want to sign up for my Patreon, where I will be posting more of those as an extra. But for now, that's all I've got for this video, going over the special relationship between Galician and Portuguese, how they developed across time, and what their status is nowadays. This, of course, is quite a broad topic with a lot to cover, and I've only just scratched the surface of Galician and Portuguese and their relationship, so if you'd like me to follow up with a video about something specific, let me know in a comment down below. But for now, that's all I've got for this video. I do hope that you enjoyed it. If you did, if you learned something or otherwise found it interesting, leave me a thumbs up down below. You might think about subscribing to my channel if you're not already. I make a ton of videos about the Portuguese language, which you can find in playlists directly on my channel or in the eye above, and I will see you next time.